a good starting point is a piece of work I made that was looking at very recent history. When I was 18, probably the age of a lot of you, or some of you, I witnessed on TV, really, the miners' strike, which is a huge industrial dispute across Britain in 1984. And it really stuck with me. The imagery of it stuck with me. And if you think about history paint, what's called history painting, which are paintings of great historical events, you know, as you'd imagine from that name, they exist throughout history. They really exist in photography now, and film, and news reports of forms of history painting. And this is one example. This is a photograph of a striking miner arguing with a policeman, who I suspect is from London because of the badge he has on his helmet. And I suspect he's arguing with him because the policeman has been violent towards one of his comrades. I suspect because police from London were brought to the north of England during the strike to really to keep order as they saw it, but also they were known to being much more violent and less sympathetic to the miners. So that's, I suspect, what's happening there. So I saw this on the 18th of June 1984. I saw a huge confrontation on the news, a massive battle basically, and it always stuck with me. And I wanted to revisit it as an artist. So in 2001, I restaged the battle with 1,000 people as a way really of making of revisiting a site of trauma, a site of violence, but also a way of re-looking at that moment in history. This is part of the reenactment. So 1,000 people took part. Former miners took part. People that were part of the original battle took part. A few policemen did. Also, local people's families took part. But the majority of people that were part of this were people from reenactment societies who we know have a very keen interest in history and dress up from all different periods of history and fight battles from history. Here's an example of the kind of thing they do at weekends. You must know, you've probably been to similar things to this or seen them on TV. So what I was really interested in doing was really the people that do this, getting them to recreate a battle from contemporary Britain and seeing if that changed their view of history and the history of Britain. And also, it was almost like I was doing an inquiry, a public inquiry into an event through art. So I was restaging this battle to remind people of what happened and to start conversations again about that moment in history. And that's what art is very good at. It's very good at starting conversations, and sometimes it's a safer space to do that. It's a place where people can come and gather, arts and art galleries that come and gather and be around each other and look at things and experience things at the same time. Even though they might have very different views about the world, they can still be in the same place experiencing the same thing. So that's something that art has the ability to do. So like I said, I was trying to think about British history, about where these sorts of the miners' strike and these sorts of events fall within British history. Are they part of this, almost like a civil war in Britain? And so it was the men that did this were of great interest to me, because they don't use, when they do reenactments, it's usually with a nod and a wink. There's a bit of humor in it, but also there's very little politics in it. It's really about the battle and about the guns and the horses and the numbers, all those kinds of things. But here, this was about politics. So it's a political reenactment. It wasn't a reenactment, a military reenactment. So very different from them, really. So like I said, that was with about 1,000 people. It was a huge event. And I never thought I'd do anything on that scale ever again, but I did a couple of years ago. And I'll talk about that in a minute as well. So I hope you can read that. This is a diagram I made that was really about how we think of history, but also how music relates to history. This is a diagram that was really explaining a project. I had an idea for a brass band to play acid house music. So I wanted a form of music making that's associated with industry, making music or covering songs that are associated with digital culture. And basically what I was trying to do was create a piece of music that told the story of Britain in the 20th century, effectively. It was a piece of music that had a narrative to it. But also I was trying to connect these two, on the face of it, very, very different musical forms. On the one hand, a very formal musical form of people sitting down in a concert hall making music. And then this other one, which was had associations with drug culture and people on the streets, people dancing in fields and so on. But they both had connections within them. They're both forms, you could argue, of sort of vernacular music, of folk music. But also they were both music's movements that were politicized or became politicized because of trade unions associated with brass bands, but also with acid house. They became politicized because of the big parties that happened that were not licensed, and then the drug use within them. And so they're within the middle of this diagram, you see this meeting point about civil unrest and media hysteria. Also, interestingly, as Britain deindustrialized, there were huge empty spaces, factories and warehouses and so on. And a lot of the parties, acid house parties, happened in those spaces. So they had a connection in that way as well. This music benefited from factories closing, ironically, because it gave a site for them, for the parties to happen. So it's storytelling really through art, but also through music. And a few years ago, I made a film, basically of this diagram, more or less of this diagram. And Fran mentioned it's called Everybody in the Place. And it takes place in a classroom in London. And it tells the story of Britain in the 80s and early 90s. And I'm in the film, which is a bit scary for me. But it's a film of me basically giving a talk like this, more or less giving a talk a little bit like this about, but really about that time between the mid 80s and the early 90s, and what life was like then, what was going on in the country, but also how the music that was being made and the way that people were consuming it at big parties was part of history as well. So it was trying to not disentangle music from history and from social history, because I saw them as, you can't really separate them because they were going along each other. They're almost parallel lines. So as this talk showing this group of young people, these students, footage from Britain from around that time, footage of parties, but also of political events, and trying to connect it to what was happening in terms of music. And this part of the film was when I had some equipment from the 80s, synthesizers, but also drum machines. And there were moments when the students could go and play on these things and then talk about the footage they'd seen and what they felt for them. What was interesting about this group of young people was that a lot of them, their parents had not been born in Britain. So they didn't have that sort of memory that other people might have had from their parents about Britain in the 80s. So for a lot of them, the footage of the miners' strike and of other things happening in Britain in the 80s was a surprise for them. They'd not seen it before. And what I was really interested in doing was making a film that that wasn't just, a lot of films about music are usually full of people who were part of a scene, but 30 years ago, sitting in recording studios or in a room with lots of records behind them, talking about how amazing it was and getting nostalgic about it. And I wasn't really interested in that. I was much more interested in the reactions of the young people. And so in a way, you see the film through their eyes, because they're experiencing some of this footage and this music for the first time, and their reactions to it are quite fresh, if not raw at times, because they don't understand aspects of it and so on. So that was the film I made. This is a still from the film. Towards the end of the film, there's a scene in a nightclub. Incredible scene. I spoke to the guy that shot it. He was just 18 at the time. And at the beginning of the film, you see a queue of people getting into the nightclub. And at the end of the film, you see the club. And we used that in our film because he just walks around the nightclub very slowly with a camera and you're picking out all the people that are dancing and so on. It's such an amazing scene. But weirdly, there's some connection to this I think. It's not a million miles away. Even if the main figure at the front here is a man, there is something about this, the feel of it, I think. It's not a million miles away from this. So this is Bar at the Folies Bergère, which is the work that I was interested in us talking about and looking at and thinking about. I don't really know that much about it, to be honest. I mean, I know a little bit, but I think it's probably the most famous work in the collection of the Courtauld. But it's about many things, not least people's social lives and technology and enjoyment and gender. All these things are still so important to us. And so we're going to talk about this painting a lot later, but just bear in mind that I'm interested in this painting for a number of reasons, not least because for me, it has a relationship to this. Also the Seurat painting, which you may or may not know in the collection. Whoops, sorry. That's me just running about. This is another painting, it's a tiny painting, again about entertainment, mass entertainment, and our memories of it, and popular culture, effectively, which is something I've always been interested in. So just bear those two works in mind, really. I'm just going to carry on and talk about a few more things I've done. I was asked in 2014 to think of a way to commemorate the first day of the Battle of the Somme, which, as you may know, was a huge disaster for the British Army. And I thought, well, if you're going to commemorate a disaster, but also something that is about death, then you should work with human beings. You shouldn't make the commemoration shouldn't be an object or lots of different objects, like lots of boots or whatever. I just thought that you should make a living memorial to the dead. So on that day, on the 16th, sorry, I can't even remember the day of it now. I think it was the 1st of July, 2016. Thousands of young people dressed in First World War uniforms just appeared and then sort of disappeared, then reappeared again all throughout Britain in big groups, mainly, but also in sort of individuals like this would peel off from the group and just stand around, and they just hung around Britain. And for me, it was a way to take the memorial to the public, to infect the space effectively. Because of course, with most memorials, most sculptures, you know where it is, it's stationary, and you go to it like a war memorial, and you look at it and then you leave, and you take a picture of it and then you leave. Whereas this one just appeared. No one knew it was going to happen. It just happened in the streets, it happened in railway stations. This is in Waterloo Station. And the participants appeared, they didn't speak to the public, and then they just hung out, and then they walked through the station, walked into shopping centres, and just got on trains and buses, and were just present in the space. They didn't speak to the public. They weren't ghosts, but they were just silent presences. Sometimes they sang a song, and if the public came up to them, they'd give out a little card which would explain, which would just basically have a name and a date, the age of the person, the date they died, which would have been 100 years from that day, and the regiment they were in. So it's like a tombstone, really. You're basically giving someone what you read on a tombstone. And this was just, it was just a surprise. Like I said, I think it was very important that people didn't know that it was going to happen. But also for me, it was very interesting. And what I really wanted was a visual disjunction, if I can call it that, where you'd see people wearing this clothing in very modern contemporary spaces like shopping centres, car parks, kind of ugly places around Britain as well. But they were just present throughout the whole of the country, and it was all over Britain. It was in Northern Ireland as well, and it was seen by many people. And it was interesting because we were very wide when we were planning this. We thought there would be problems. The public might be quite anti it. They might not like the idea of people, of soldiers on the streets. It's not something you see very much in Britain. You see it in Northern Ireland, but you don't see it in mainland Britain. And so we were very concerned that people might get verbally or physically abused. It didn't happen. quite the opposite happened, actually. People got very visibly upset, and we weren't expecting that. I think one reason people were upset was because it was literally a week after the Brexit vote, and I think people were very upset regardless about what happened with the vote. However you'd voted, the behaviour of politicians afterwards, I don't know if you remember, was pretty despicable. And I think people understood when they saw this what the idea of sacrifice was, in terms of patriotism and sacrifice, what it actually meant to people. Where you'd just seen a lot of politicians in the previous week stabbing each other in the back and sacrificing, effectively, I would argue, their country for themselves, for their careers. These are people that sacrificed their lives for their country. So I think it had a deep effect on people in ways they weren't even that sure about. This is a work that was never made, effectively. It was never made. It was meant to be a grand historical statement on the fourth plinth of Trafalgar Square. I was shortlisted for the fourth plinth competition, and I had an idea to get a car that had been destroyed in a bomb attack in Iraq, because this was during the Iraq War, and put it on the fourth plinth and have it present for the public to look at. And it would, over the 2-year period, it would disintegrate and rust and make a horrible mess on the plinth. Clearly, this was a statement about war and about our involvement in that war, and bringing a piece of evidence back effectively from Iraq, so we could see what was going on there, or just placing it in the center of London. It's quite an imperial space, let's face it, Trafalgar Square. You have South Africa House to your left, and to your right you have Canada House. So it was the heart of the empire, effectively. So it was bringing this thing back from one of these adventures, effectively. It didn't happen, but I was very, very keen to continue this idea. So I did get a car. In this picture, it might not be very clear, but there's actually a destroyed car in that photograph, and that car is from Baghdad. It was blown up in a bomb attack. The bomb was not in the car. The car would not be there if the bomb had been in it. But the car was destroyed in a bomb attack in a marketplace. And I took it across America. I towed it across America with an Iraqi citizen. You see him there sitting on the car, and an American soldier. And we just went almost randomly. It was planned, but we just turned up at places, and people didn't know we were going to turn up. And we would just park up, and people would talk to us about this object. And you can see there's a text on the car saying that this car was destroyed by bomb in a Baghdad marketplace on March the 5th, 2007. Very bland statement, really, not anti-war, not pro-war, just a factual statement of what had happened to that car. And we just got reactions from the public. We spoke to them. We filmed some of the reactions. We interviewed people. But on the whole, it was just something for people to look at. And in a way, it was better than what I was going to do in Trafalgar Square, because it was in the streets. It wasn't on a plinth. It was on ground level. And people had many reactions to it. We'll talk about that in a minute. But that's what's called an intervention, basically. That's a classic intervention, when you're taking something from somewhere and you're shoving it in a place where it shouldn't really be, and you're intervening in everyday life. And that was important for me, to take something, again, like the soldiers, didn't look right, really. You weren't expecting to see it. But this was an object that you were not expecting to see that morning when you left your house to go to work or to go to college or wherever. This is in Arizona. And it was intervening physically, but also psychologically. And that was an important thing to do. This was towards the end of the trip. We went to a, whoops, bear with me. I'm getting used to this. This is towards the end, we went to a town where there's a Marine base nearby. And you see these murals. These are history paintings as well. We were talking about history paintings earlier on. History paintings of in honor of the Marines. And we took the car there. It was a bit of a photo op. But what was interesting was that most Americans who saw this, regardless of their political beliefs, were actually interested, and they were interested in talking to the Iraqi citizen and talking to the soldier. We sort of covered our bases. we didn't want to go in as an anti-war work. We wanted to go in as a work. Again, this idea of conversation, creating a space for conversation and for some kind of dialogue around a difficult issue. And so also we were lucky, this is pre-Trump. This was Obama's first year, so people were a little bit more relaxed about talking. But it's not all, everything I do isn't doom and gloom and violence. This is a project I made with an inflatable Stonehenge called Sacrilege. And this is it in Glasgow, I think. On the first weekend it happened. And I basically wanted people to think about British history and enjoy being around it. Being able to go on to Stonehenge and bounce on it is, of course, a ridiculous, stupid idea, because that's never going to happen. You can't do that because you can't even go into the stones. And so for it to be an inflatable sculpture, made of air, effectively traveling around Britain is a huge contradiction. It's quite interesting, because when it's toured the world, and wherever it goes, it gets the same reaction. And I think it's very important that we as a country can have a sense of humor around our history, because I think as soon as you stop having a sense of humor around your history and your mythologies around your history, that's when things get difficult. And also when governments or countries try to impose a view of history upon you as a nation, and say this is what it means to be British, this is Britishness, it's not this, it's that, that's when you're in trouble. So for me, it was very important to make something of an object that is in a way a sacred object, but people can still enjoy it. And also the whole point about Stonehenge is it's a mysterious object. No one really knows, and no one will ever know exactly what happened there. We won't know how people spoke, the music they made, what happened. We have a good idea. And so it's great that this symbol of Britain is in fact a huge mystery. And that's why people like it so much, because they can project their views of Britain onto it. And so this for me was very important, to make something like this, because it's great that at the heart of our identity is Stonehenge, but it's a mystery. And I think that's how it should be. That's how our identity as a nation should be open to interpretation and should be mysterious, but also enjoyable. Unlike this is I made a film in 2019. I was hanging around Parliament Square, and again this idea of history happening in front of your eyes. And I was around Parliament Square in 2019 when all the big votes were happening, and Theresa May was Prime Minister. And it seems so long ago now, doesn't it? It was only 2 years ago. So it's pre-Boris Johnson. Almost feels like another era, and in a way it was. And I was just filming people, mainly people on the far right and the right, who were pro-Brexit and their behaviour and what they're saying about Britain, trying to kind of get in their heads, see what they really thought about the country, because for me it was very confusing, their attitudes. And so I made this film. It's called Putin's Happy, and it's really just me hanging around, chatting, not imposing a view necessarily. There's no voiceover. It's just observing what was coming and going, the comings and goings, I suppose you'd call it. And it was a very confusing place to be. There was a lot of noise. It was quite tense. People, different views. Visually, it was quite interesting, but orally as well, just what the noise that were being made, the music, people shouting. And I'd never seen anything like it in Britain. And it was just chaos, basically. So I was trying to sort of look at chaos and capture it. But really, I was interested in people whose opinion I had nothing in common with in terms of their views on Europe, because I really was interested in what why they were motivated to be like they were. Having said that, there were moments in the film that were not like that, people who were not like that. So, because you couldn't make a film that was all about that, it was just too depressing to watch. So at one point, I saw a group of young people were running through the streets laughing, and I interviewed them about Brexit. They just had a visit to the Houses of Parliament, and they were talking about their relationship to Britain. And strangely, even though they were anti-Brexit and Brexit was going to happen, they were still very confident about Britain. And what you found was that a lot of the white older people really were down on the country. They thought the country was terrible and it would never be good again, and it was only good in the past. Where these young people were actually very excited about the future and their future, despite living in a country that had just voted to leave the EU. So it's really, that was quite heartening to see that. I'm going to try and scroll down. It's possible. I don't know if it is. No, I can't scroll down. Okay. There's one moment in the film. Well, there's lots of moments in the film where you see people on the right and the far right, and this guy had covered himself in tattoos full of conspiracy theories and biblical references and far right references as well, and football. And I felt that was an interesting thing to look at and to document. I don't think it has any relevance whatsoever for what we're going to talk about today, but it was something that I'd never really seen before in London. And so I was keen to document it. I didn't interview him. I was too scared to. Going back to this idea that I have of some kind of wall hanging or tapestry for this room. It's just a beginning thought. I have a friend that makes things like this. This is a death in custody banner he makes. He makes lots of banners for trade unions and so on. And I think why I like the idea of banners is the material element to them. And they have a presence which a painting doesn't have. It's quite interesting in a way. Not that I have anything against painting whatsoever, but paintings are stuck, kind of has a solidity to them, where it's something in that's made like a tapestry or a banner literally has a movement to it because of the fabric. But there's something about it that, for me personally, it has a life that maybe a painting doesn't have. The idea of a life, especially with ones like this, because they're paraded through the streets of London often. You know, they have their dual use, you could say. They look nice, but also they have a purpose. They're telling you something. And this is, like I said, by a friend of mine who makes lots of banners. In a way, I think we should try and, if you think about the last year in America and in Britain, it's been an amazing year visually for in terms of politics and demonstrations, but also in terms of people gathering. I mean, the most gatherings that happened really in the last year, let's say, or 2020 at least, were people demonstrating about something. And I went on a lot of the demonstrations. I went on anti-vax demonstrations. Not that I am anti-vax, I hasten to add, but just to see what people did, how they behaved, what they'd made, things, what they were carrying, what they were dressed like. And then, of course, all the gatherings and demonstrations after George Floyd's murder, and how people looked at history and how they looked at their public art and statuary. And that's something for me that was very interesting. This is incredible. This is a Robert E. Lee statue. I think it's in Harrisburg. And this incredible use of it now, or at the time, with projections on it and graffiti. It looked amazing, I felt, and performances happening on it. And that for me was a very interesting moment. I'll go back to it actually, because it's incredible. That's Harriet Tubman, I think, the projection. Of course, some of these things are sort of contemporary art strategies almost, that the projections have been done for a long time, but they're so effective. And I thought, well, this is a really good way to think about difficult statues, is to almost to redecorate them and recontextualize them like that. On a funnier note, there were, I'm sure you remember, the students who put up signs when they were confined to their halls of residence. So this is one of the funnier moments during the lockdown. Then going back to the Black Lives Matter marches, this is one in London. So actually, visually, it was an incredible year because there's so much happening in public. People putting stuff in windows, demonstrations, people talking about statues and history. This is a poster I made, which I sold cheaply So it would go up in windows so people would see it. It wasn't sold as an artwork, it was really sold as a poster. I was involved in a small way with a project in which a clothing guy who runs a sort of clothing company, but also does all the other things, called Sports Banger, asked young people to customize the letter that Boris Johnson sent every household. And he had a collection of hundreds of them, and we put on an exhibition. So this one says, "Get down the toilet, Boris." It's a letter from Boris. You can just see the writing behind about lockdown. And this is the young guy who made it, the boy who made it, visiting the exhibition and pointing to the work. We had a fancy dress day and he came as a bear. Also, another moment during of interest last year was there was very little advertising, because brands were not advertising. The only people that were really advertising were the government, telling us what to do. So there's a lot of space to make work. A lot of people that owned these advertising spaces were getting artists to make things, to commemorate things. And I got to do some work for World Human Rights Day. And I did a whole series of posters about all these sites in the world where people's human rights are being abused, and just reminding people it's still Human Rights Day in that place, in that country, in the Mediterranean, in Britain as well, of course. So it's just a whole series, about 12 different places around the world. Of course, there are thousands where people's human rights are being abused. And it's actually very difficult to come to whittle it down to 12, to be honest. Also, there were strange things like this, which I'm not, again, maybe has nothing to do with what we're doing today, but I just felt it was one of the most bizarre, almost artwork-like things that someone did. I mean, it's about painting as well. We have to remember, painting isn't just on canvas. People do it on themselves, on their bodies, and on their faces, on their skin. And this woman had done this very, very odd sort of homage to Captain Tom, tribute, I should say. That has many different levels of understanding. I made a print that got some people very annoyed. It's meant to look a little bit like something from art history, like a painting almost. It's a fire. It's Lachlan Murdoch's house in Sydney Harbour. Lachlan Murdoch runs Fox News, Rupert Murdoch's son, and it's his house on fire because of a bushfire that's happening because of climate change. So it's meant to be an apocalyptic image, effectively, of his house on fire, because he's one of the biggest sort of promoters of climate change denial in the world. So back to the paintings that are in the Courtauld collection. This is Manon as well, I believe, La Loge. I just think the Impressionist works are interesting to me. I didn't study them at the Courtauld. I didn't really get to do what we'd call modern art at all. But I think the painter's relationship to their lives, to cities, to photography, to emancipation maybe of women, potentially, I don't know. We'll find out about that later. But they are about city life, and maybe the beginning of what we would know as popular culture and the sort of entertainment industry and so on. These things are very interesting to me when you think of the rigidity of the painting that had come before, and it really was very rigid in terms of the heroization of men and history and the classical art that had gone before. You can see why people were really worried by Impressionism. And now we take Impressionism for granted. We just see it as very pretty. I don't think we understand that maybe there's revolutionary moments within it, and the disgust that people had at paintings like this. I don't know if that's in the collection. It might not be, actually. Fran will tell us. But this is Toulouse-Lautrec.
I didn't recognize the previous one.
No, I don't think it is. Sorry. I just liked it. But
like a Degas.
Yes, it's beautiful, isn't it? So the Toulouse-Lautrec is in the collection. It's the back room at the Dead Rat. And what a great title for a painting. For that alone, I think that might be my talk. I'm just going to say, then we have one of the small Suros in the collection. So wherever you go, even though it's a landscape, it's an urban landscape, because there's a chimney in the background and a bridge, and it was just another way. It was a different way of looking at the world, literally and metaphorically. And I think that's what's interesting about Impressionism. Despite the thought that they're very cozy now, They weren't at the time. I think that might be my talk. I think that is my talk. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. If I can find a way to do it.
Thank you so much.
That's all right.
And if you wouldn't mind just checking your camera as well, Jeremy, and I would invite the people who've asked questions, particularly if you don't mind switching your camera on. I know, actually, I recognise quite a lot of the names here. I know you guys have been to our sessions before.
Okay. I have questions.
So we've just got
Sorry,
great questions actually in the chat, just a few, and then we will move on to look at the Manet and other Impressionist works in a bit more detail.
Do you have a question, Fran, before anyone starts?
I'll let the students take priority on this because they've got some really great ones.
Okay.
Should I read them out? I'm not sure if you can see the chat at the moment.
I haven't looked at it yet.
I'll read them out just in case other people can't see the chat. So from Mimi, how did you initially make the connection between acid house and brass band music? Why did you choose to fuse these two genres?
Well, I mean, I felt that they both had a lot in common. They were both related to specific historical moments. One was associated with heavy industry, brass bands, and the other was associated with a digital culture. Brass bands became a politicized form of music making because of trade unions and the miners' strike. I remember that very clearly. And acid house music became politicized, even though it was about people enjoying themselves. The government got involved very quickly and tried to stop the parties. And so by accident, they were both politicized music forms. And they're both very strong in the north of England, and they both had a kind of amateur aspect to them.
Thank you. I suspect some of young people here will have used that kind of mind mapping technique as well in their own artwork. It's such a useful process. We can see Toya doing some as well in her illustrations at the moment. It might be something helpful to come back to actually in the project in relation to our main artwork. So the questions, they do relate to different artworks you've discussed, Jeremy. The next one from Noah. When organising or creating these artworks, do you have a desired effect or response in mind? Is there a fixed feeling you want your work to emanate, or is it reactionary?
I think you can't really predict how people will react to your work, Noah. I think you just don't know what. You can never predict the public. They can't be controlled, unfortunately, sometimes. But, I know what I want to get from it. And often a big work, like the one with the soldiers, for example, that's basically an experiment. I'm just experimenting. It's all with the car going around America. It's like, what would happen if you did this and you took it here and people saw it? This plus this plus this equals what? I mean, we could have been attacked by people. We didn't know what was going to happen when we took the car around America. It could have been quite dangerous for us, but luckily it wasn't. But it was basically, art is really, in a way, a lot of experimentation, just to see how things look and how people react to them. You don't really know what you're doing a lot of the time. You're not necessarily in control as much as you might think.
I wonder how many people here actually saw some of those works, whether some people here experienced the soldiers at the stations. I think I was one of the people who got upset, actually.
Did you?
Yeah, definitely. Well, the Waterloo Station, really powerful. And as you say, it was partly, I think, the unexpected nature, but also that climate of Brexit. And
they were young men as well. A lot of the people that took part, most of them were young and they were male. And I think there's something about that as well. They're teenagers, a lot of them, as they would have been in the war. So I think it was about that sort of that aspect to it. There's a poignancy there, maybe the Brexit thing. I actually wrote my notebook. I wrote, "I want to make children cry" in my notebook because I wanted to scare people. I wanted to scare children.
It brought people.
I didn't. I don't think I made children cry. I did make other people cry, but not in the sort of quite the way I thought I might.
I think children were more interested, probably, based on reactions I saw. But I think it prompted a lot of thought. I went home and I looked at, there's the online resource, and you can see on your street, or even actually I could even see in my building, because I would have been a Victorian building at that point, who had died in World War I, not just in that battle.
Yeah.
yeah, really, really thought-provoking. Helen, you saw them too. Yeah, I think, yeah, probably most of the Courtauld staff actually come in via Waterloo were quite affected by that.
We started the day in railway stations because we knew that would be where hundreds of thousands of people would see it, even if they didn't want to or know about it. They would have to see it because there would be these groups of men there singing or congregating. So we purposely started there because I knew that that means by 9 o'clock in the morning, people would have seen it. They would have Instagrammed it, they would have tweeted or whatever, taken pictures, and so it would have gone viral. As they were, it's like a viral artwork in a sense, but moving through the body of Britain, it would have gone viral because people would just start sharing stuff and saying, "I saw this. Did you see that?" And then it would just like have its again proliferate and have its own life.
And our next question, more sort of general question from Amber: how do you decide what events to present, and how many ideas would you have before deciding on the one?
I get asked to do things specifically about. So sometimes you get asked. So with the soldiers, I was asked to do something about that event. So it's commission effectively. But other things, it's just what I'm interested in. And if someone asks you, would you be interested in doing this? And I'd say, well, not really. I'd be more interested in doing that. So it's a balance, really. But a lot of these things cost a lot of money to do. You know, over £1 million. So I can't just do them myself. You have to have people behind you or institutions behind you.
Thank you. And actually, Mimi, I can see you've got your camera on. Would you like to ask your question rather than me doing it on your behalf? Thank you so much for showing your face.
Yeah, my question was, do you find it difficult to separate your own views on like topics like war or Brexit from the projects you create? And do you think it's important in your role as an artist to distance yourself from those like really kind of divisive debates?
Well, I think you made a good point. Try and separate yourself from the debate, the divisive debate, but it doesn't mean you can't examine the issues, but try and do it in a slightly different way. So that Brexit film I made, I mean, I'm not one of those people, but I'm interested in them. It wasn't condemning them necessarily. It was letting them speak for themselves, and they might say things you didn't like. And there were moments where it was kind of obvious what I felt about the situation, but not about individuals. Try and be fair, because if you're not doing that, then you're making propaganda, and there's enough of that around, really. I was trying to get into their minds a bit, but the very fact that I chose that subject means I'm interested in it and I have a view clearly, which I do. But I was basically trying to talk to people who are like my family members. Some of my family members are like these people, and so I have a kind of a small sympathy with them up to a point. So I felt I could talk to them okay. But there's nothing should be off limits for artists, really. I mean, why? I think there's nothing off limits for writers or filmmakers or journalists. So artists should have no fear where they go, really. Or should have a lot of fear sometimes if they're doing stuff that's dangerous, but you can go where you want.
So would you say you kind of take a journalist approach when you're making those kind of like documentary style films?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. It's journalistic. Not a journalist, because they would do things much better and more thoroughly, but as journalistic, because you're getting into the contemporary daily politics of something. You know, I'm not looking back with the Brexit thing. It was about that being in the moment, in a historical moment, let's face it, and just trying to talk to people and get them to say things or try and understand them. But yes, it's a journalistic method. But you couldn't show that film I made on TV because I didn't do things that journalists usually do, and so didn't get release forms from people. You usually have to get permission from people if you interviewed them. I didn't do that because they wouldn't have been interviewed otherwise. They don't want to sign a form, like a legal form. There's no way they'd do that. So I wasn't thorough as a journalist might be. And also some people incriminated themselves in things they said, so they wouldn't want to sign a form.
That must be a different thing. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mimi. Remy, you've got your hand raised.
Yes.
Would you like to unmute?
I just noticed that most of the artworks that you showed were quite heavily politicized and to do with the public interaction. And do you reckon the whole art for the sake of art and the personal experience of art has slowly gone out of fashion, or it's in decline, and the more political art, I guess, is being put to the forefront because it's more about the interaction and the shocking nature of some of the artworks that are now on display?
I think that there'll always be space for art's sake, art for itself, art about itself, and that's always going to be fine. I think we're particularly in a moment in the last year or 2 years where there is more political art being made, that's for sure. But I think that's where we are. 5 years ago, there was everyone was making a lot of money. Well, painters were doing big sploshy abstract work, which was dubbed crapstraction. I don't know if you're aware of this. Such a good name. And that was the thing. You know, you had young artists who were out of college making tons and tons of money doing these big works, big sploshy works, and they probably disappeared for the moment, at least, because no one's interested in that anymore. So we're on to the next thing, and the next thing is political art, and then it'll be something in 3 or 4 years' time, I'm sure. So, but art will always exist for its own sake, and that's going to be fine. Fran, you're silent.
Sorry, I was going to say, I suspect there are some more questions coming. I can see people typing, but I think at this point we'll go back to the mayonnaise bar and
Right.
Oh, Noah's got his hand up.
I think Noah's. Oh no, maybe that was a.
I don't know if that was accidental or not. Noah? Yeah, Noah, do you want to unmute? I'm just going to start sharing my screen, so that'll give me a moment to do that if you want to ask a question.
Hi, yeah, I was going to ask, like, do you feel the need to record your art? Like, I can imagine your soldiers walking around Waterloo. Obviously, that's quite temporary. But do you feel the need to, like, document it for, like, so that people can look back at it and question their, like, responses? Or, yeah, like, what, as an artist, do you feel the need to record it?
That's a good question. Can you still hear me? I can see you on the screen. Yeah. I think that yes, up to a point. I mean, with the one with the soldiers, the public documented it effectively. We had photographers out, but really the public were the documentarians of it, because everyone has a phone now and everyone filmed it. So that's a great resource. That was a great resource. There is a problem a lot of the time with art in that people, you go to a performance or go to an event and there's more people with cameras than there are audience, because the documentation is more important than the work sometimes. But I do document things. We made films with the car from Baghdad. They're very scrappy little films, though. They weren't big production numbers, and we didn't want to intimidate people, because I think if you have a lot of cameras and tripods and lights, you intimidate people. And also, when I was making the Brexit film, I went with one other person I'm quite short. He was even shorter than me. We had a little camera, so we weren't news, we weren't BBC, which a lot of people hated, and so we were just we were not intimidating. With two little blokes sort of walking around talking to people, and so I think you can over document things. I see a question here, or a statement from Canna.
Yes.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Thank you for your statement. I just wanted to say my name. I was wondering, how did you get the idea for getting a car all the way from Iraq and presenting it to people? And why did you do such a thing? Okay, well, I wanted to get a car. Are you okay? There we go. Okay, Canna. Well, basically, I'd lived, that the war in Iraq. I was in 9/11 war in Iraq. That was 5 or 6 years of our lives, at least, maybe more. That we had that as a news story constantly on our minds. And I was traveling a lot at the time. I was traveling in America a lot, and so it was even worse there. And for a young person, if you're 10 years old and the day of 9/11, the whole teenage life is taken up with the war in Iraq and the consequences of that. And so it was driving me nuts, actually, a bit, and I just couldn't not think about anything else. and I was determined. I really wanted to get something from Iraq, bring it to Britain for people to look at it, because I just felt conversations around it, the war, were so abstracted. I never met anyone who'd been there. Well, I only knew one person that had been there. And so for me, I just wanted a piece of evidence from the conflict to come and be seen in the center of London and just stuck there, this disgusting thing, which was going to rot on the plinth and stain the plinth. It was a real provocation, basically, and it was a kind of ugly, horrible thing to do. And I was very glad I did it. And so it was me. Why did you do such a thing? Yes. So it was really, a lot of these things are personal, even though it's a big public event, like the miners' strike thing. And it was because I'd seen that as an 18-year-old, and it really affected me. And then the car, I was just obsessed with the war, and it was driving me nuts. And so it was just something that I felt I had to do if I could, because I knew that no one else would be able to do that, in the sense that only an artist, I do believe, could have done that project in that way and got the car and taken it across America. I don't know how else it could have been done, really, under what other auspices. Art was actually a very good means to do something like that. So that's why I did it, because it was the whole thing was so upsetting as a war, because it was so clearly a bad idea. So for me, that's why I did it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
That's all right. Have you come to Britain from Iraq, or were you born in Britain?
I came from Iraq to Britain because of the war.
Right. And when did you? So how long have you been in Britain for?
I came in September 2017.
Okay. Right.
So I had to learn English and everything, so it was hard. But yeah.
Okay. Well, welcome to this class, or whatever this is. It's not a class, is it? I shouldn't say that. Whatever it is. But I'm glad you saw it, and I hope you appreciate it in some way. It's actually that project. I don't know if you're aware. You might be. If you do art history, it's on the art history syllabus, isn't it?
Yeah.
I don't know if you do history, so it's part of that. And the car now is in the Imperial War Museum. So if you go into the Imperial War Museum, it's almost the first thing you see is the car. It has a very, very good positioning, and they're trying to make the museum now about the victims of war and about civilians, and the car for them was something they really wanted. So it was very, very happy that it's there and seen by lots of people.
Yeah, thank you so much.
That's a pleasure. Thanks for your question.
And just one more, actually, relating to the car, just coming from Marianne. Was there any negative reaction towards the car project?
This is a very interesting question, because we were expecting to be, attacked, physically attacked, if not verbally attacked, when we went across America, because we took the car through Texas, Alabama, Tennessee. We went to quite right-wing, what you'd see is very traditional right-wing areas. We didn't go to Florida, we went near to Florida. These places where you might expect trouble, because it's not metropolitan areas. People might not be happy to see that object. So we were very worried, but a few people weren't very happy to see it, but not many. I mean, a few, and they might have told us. They weren't rude to us. The people that were really angry with us were people who were very anti-war, because they said by presenting this, you didn't present it in an anti-war enough way, because you weren't using it as a piece of sort of propaganda, a propaganda object. And they were a bit upset that we weren't more anti-war about it, even though we were definitely anti-war, just by doing it as an anti-war statement. They thought we were being a bit too sitting on the fence, which we were doing because we didn't want to annoy everyone. You annoy by being anti-war, you annoy half the population at least. But if you're just in the middle, as it were, no one can get really, really annoyed with you, because you have a soldier and you have an Iraqi citizen, and you have this sort of you're trying to create a sort of middle space, basically.